Let us begin. Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Very warm welcome to the Psychology at Roehampton seminar series, otherwise known as PROS. I'm James Glean. I'm Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Roehampton, and I chair these PROS sessions. For those who haven't joined us before, these sessions are out every 2 or 3 weeks on a Friday lunchtime, just like this, and we invite leading figures in the world of mental health and wellbeing research and clinical practice to come and talk to us about their work. So as I mentioned, we're in a scintillating program at the moment, and we've got more great talks coming up. To see who those are, so you can join us, you can follow us on Twitter at pros_roe, R-O-E, or you can email me at pros@roehampton.ac.uk and I'll add you to the mailing list. So I do hope you come back and join us for future talks. The videos of all talks and the previous ones before this are available on the PROS seminar website. So if, for example, anyone who wanted to join today couldn't make it, they can catch up by watching online. Moving on to today's talk, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Lucy Johnstone, who's a consultant clinical psychologist and former program director of the Bristol Clinical Psychology Doctorate. She's worked in adult mental health in various settings for many years, most recently in South Wales. She has written a number of books, mostly focusing on psychological formulation and psychiatric diagnosis. And she's the lead author, along with Mary Boyle, of the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, which of course we're hearing about today. This is a project funded by the Division of Clinical Psychology to outline a conceptual alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. Now, of course, the framework has attracted considerable national and international interest, as evidenced by the number of people joining us today. It's fantastic. And so we're delighted that Lucy is joining us today to outline the principles of the project and to describe some of its current applications. Just before I pass over, a bit of housekeeping. The general format is going to be 40 to 45 minutes of the talk, and then 10-15 minutes of Q&A. Can everyone please mute yourself and keep muted throughout the presentation, please? I'd rather do that than have questions interrupt the presentation, so we can be sure we get through it in time. I think for questions, as we get towards the end of the talk, maybe if you could put your questions in the chat, I'll pick some out from the chat to ask Lucy rather than be muting, unmuting, etc. So let's press on. Again, Lucy, thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us about the PTMF. Over to you. I will now...
Thank you. Delighted to be with you, although it'd be nicer to be with you all in person, but still we're all getting used to this now, aren't we? And I think, James, there's the option of us continuing for about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes after 2 o'clock, if people are still interested and still want to ask questions. So, and I can see a number of people in the audience who've heard me give a very similar talk a number of times before, kind of you to turn up. So let's hope for some extra interesting questions. So it feels like there's something a bit new for you. But anyway, very pleased to see all of you. I'm now going to do the most difficult part of the whole presentation, which is to try and share screen. I'm really not a computer confident person. So I click on share screen. I click on that. Is anything happening, James?
Not at the moment.
Click on this. Aha. Does that look like it?
Yeah, we've got it.
So I click from beginning. I've gone too far. Is that okay? Is that looking like it should do?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So last time I did this, there was a technical hitch about 5 minutes in. Let's hope that doesn't happen this time. I'm going to rattle through, as James says, for about 45 minutes. If there's any technical hitches or I become inaudible or I vanish altogether, James and I are in phone contact. Hope you'll tell me, James. And this is going to be really quite a brief overview. The Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, as some of you may know, is a long, complex document. All I can hope to do today is give you a kind of flavour of it. I'm going to point you towards various resources and the main website. So if you're interested, you can find out more. And I'm also going to give my usual warning, which is these are quite busy slides with lots of information on. I've given up apologising for that because I always do the same thing next time. But what I usually say is, please don't feel you have to read every word on every slide. They're kind of wallpaper, if you like, and I will highlight the most relevant bits of any slide. And you can have the slides and indeed the recording afterwards if you don't quite catch everything as we go through. So off we go. So this is the Power Threat Meaning Framework, what it's about. You will be aware, I'm sure, that there are a number of critiques of the diagnostic model around. This is increasingly entering kind of mainstream practice, the idea that, you know, there are serious challenges to the diagnostic model, sometimes called the medical model, on which psychiatric interventions are based. And indeed, you have your own lecturer at Roehampton, James Davies, who's written a brilliant book about this, Cracked. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a ludicrously, ridiculously ambitious attempt to outline what would a conceptual alternative to the diagnostic model look like. So it's going well beyond, instead of using this word, we'll use that word, or we need a revised and more reliable version of what we've got. It's trying to start right from first principles, going right back to basic philosophical conceptual principles in order to outline something very different. It's a 5-year project, as I said, and the other thing I always say is it's a bit like having kids. If you knew what it was going to be involved, you'd probably never embark on it in the first place. So it's probably just as well we didn't know, because having got out the other end, we're pleased we've done it. It's not an official DCP or BPS model. Nobody has to read it, like it, agree with it, put it into practice or do anything else with it. It's actually a conceptual resource. It's not a how-to manual. It doesn't say, do this, do that. That we envisage that as the second stage of the project, if you like, that we were going to outline a set of principles, and we were hoping that at least some people might be interested enough to take these principles and start translating them into practice in various ways in their own settings, and feedback to us and evaluate those attempts, and thus we would be engaged in a kind of ongoing process of developing the framework further. And it's really not saying stop everything you're doing and do this instead, because one of its aims is to offer further evidence and validation and support for many, many good examples of on diagnostic practice that are already around, so that they actually become the default model rather than something you might be looking at.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Alarm on mute.
Back.
Okay, please go on mute, or Lucy, if you can mute people.
Okay.
You can mute everyone.
Can you hear me?
Just someone called Ergi Hondachi, who's got a bit of background noise.
Okay, shall I carry on?
Yeah, you might just want to mute people at the top of the participants list who aren't muted. There's just
I don't know how to do that.
You can just right click on their name and.
I can't see them. Sort of thing makes me panic.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay.
I shall proceed.
All right, okay, yeah.
I don't know what a technophobia I have. Okay, so I'm going to proceed. Is there a way of you muting people?
I can try and reclaim the host and try that. Should I try that? Okay, done that. Off you go.
Okay, so I'm not muted, I hope.
No, you're fine, yeah.
Okay, off. Continue. So these are the contributors to the project over a 5-year period. The people in the top group are all psychologists, and Jackie and Eleanor, as you may well know, are quite high-profile survivors. And so this is a co-produced document produced alongside service users or survivors. And as the project continued, we drew on a wide range of other forms of expertise, as you can see. The project group members have all known each other for many years, decades, in fact, in some cases, and we started from a very, very similar position as clinicians, as researchers, as people with lived experience of really not adhering to, believing in, supporting the current diagnostic model, and really wanting to develop something different. And all of us in our different ways have produced work that has contributed to that. So, and this is pointers to, if you're interested in pursuing any of this, the main website is slowly being populated, too slowly actually, it's a bit frustrating, but anyway, there are a number of emerging examples of translating the framework into practice appearing on the website. There's the documents, there's the resources, there's a number of interviews, there's talks, so do keep an eye on that. The main framework document is a vast one of 200,000 words, and if I'm face-to-face with people, I sometimes say, has anyone read it? And the typical response out of an audience is about 1 in 50 might bravely put up their hand and say, I've read it. good news is you don't have to read it. But what we did want to do to make this document as firmly grounded as possible was to do a massive overview of all the evidence, biological, psychological, social, about the causal factors in what we probably wouldn't in the framework called mental health, but anyway, mental health. So I think the main document has to exist. It's the solid foundation, we hope, of the framework, and there are a number of more accessible versions on the website. And as you can see, there's a number of translations in progress. And I've travelled to all of it. I haven't travelled to South Korea. I've travelled to the other countries to talk about the framework, which is great. Can't do that at the moment, of course. And this has come out a matter of a few weeks ago. This is not free. This is 12 quid from PCCS Books. All the other documents and resources are free. This is a more accessible version, very much based on how might you apply this in practice for yourself, because the framework is about all of us, the people you're working with or supporting. So that was my Christmas presents this year. Very easy. All sorts of people who didn't know they needed it found this arriving on their doorstep for Christmas. So what is this about? It's about moving beyond the DSM mindset, which is a phrase that Mary Boyle coined. It's not just about, as I said, replacing one label with another. It's about a whole way of thinking, which we have called medicalization, which is about the assumption that is often not questioned, that models designed for understanding bodies can be applied to people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And of course, this model works pretty well in most parts of general medicine. But can it be wholesale applied to people's thoughts, feelings, behaviours, to their emotional and psychological distress? We think not. We think we need a framework that actually allows for understanding people in their relational, social and political environments, acting and making meaning within their life circumstances. And an awful lot of what we've drawn on is not new. Probably about 95% of it isn't new, but we hope we've assembled it in a different way that is actually convincing and helpful in its own right. So our aim is to recognise that distress is understandable in circumstances, to restore the link between distress and social injustice, very, very important purpose of the framework, increase people's access to power and resources, create validating narratives. Very broadly speaking, we are proposing that narratives of all kinds can replace psychiatric diagnoses, and to promote social action, because we cannot solve what, as I say, we probably wouldn't call a mental health crisis purely at an individual or service level. We have to look at the wider roots of distress. So because it's a very long and complex document, we've actually kind of distilled it into some core questions. And these questions are an expansion of the survivor slogan that I'm sure you've come across, which is, instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. So we've kind of expanded it in this way, and in a minute I'm going to talk you through these questions. What has happened to you? So the PTMF version is, how is power operating your life? How did it affect you? What sense did you make of it? What did you have to do to survive? Each of these questions is themselves based on a summary of evidence, as I say. So for example, the large and growing amount of evidence that all sorts of things that happen to you, not surprisingly, it's common sense really, have an impact on your emotional well-being as well as on other aspects of your life. And you might want to add or start with these questions. So the book that I just showed you, each chapter is based on an exploration of these questions and a discussion about how, by reflecting on these questions in what will probably be a kind of iterative process, people can develop gradually over time a narrative which we think is going to offer a better understanding and a non-medical understanding of their distress. And these are really not questions that have to be asked in those words, in that order. It's not meant to be like that. They're areas to consider, and if you're interested, you can reframe that in any way you like, but we're saying these areas do need to be considered. So, and these are not separate questions. It's not power plus threat plus meaning plus threat response, a little bit like we sometimes think of the so-called biopsychosocial model, bio, add a bit of socio, add a bit of psycho on top. These are different aspects of on the same phenomenon. As we go through the questions, you'll see that each of them implies the others. So I'm now going to go through the questions very briefly, and the reason we've started with power in the framework and put it really up front very explicitly is because it is our view that power in all its guises is what is almost by definition missing from psychiatric diagnosis, but is also missing for an awful lot of psychology and psychotherapy. So it's not just a critique about psychiatric diagnosis as a way of understanding distress, it's actually a critique of many versions of psychology and psychotherapy, particularly in their narrower versions, like their kind of IAPT versions, let's say, would be one example of something that we've actually criticised at some length in the framework. So power is everywhere. Power is everywhere, and power can operate in all sorts of different ways. Don't need to read all that teeny tiny writing. We've expanded on this in the documents, but in essence, these are, you could divide this up in different ways, but these are a number of areas of power that we need to consider in thinking about the kind of the ultimate context of people's distress. And some of these we're used to thinking about, some of these we're getting more used to thinking about. So interpersonal power covers roughly the arena of kind of trauma-informed practice, which is, the framework draws a lot on trauma-informed practice, although it also points out some of the limitations of trauma-informed practice. So we're, particularly if we're therapists or professionals, we are, I hope, used to thinking about interpersonal power. We're less used to thinking about these other forms of power. And this is not saying all power is bad, power is neutral. And if we're professionals, we are hoping to use our power and our knowledge helpfully and supportively. But by definition, you're thinking about distress, you are thinking more about the more negative ways that power can operate. So among the forms of power we don't usually think about very much are social and cultural capital. I'm a very good example of someone who's fortunate enough to have a lot of social and cultural capital. I'm white, I'm able-bodied, I'm middle class, I'm highly educated, and so on. And actually, many of the people who end up in mental health services do not start with those advantages, do not have those advantages. And of course, by applying a diagnostic label, then there are further barriers to them accessing the kind of some of the obvious and the less obvious, more subtle ways that you can make your life and the life of your family easier for yourself, negotiate your way through life better, and if you have access to social and cultural capital. And ideological power, we've spent a lot of time talking about ideological power. It's a very, 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 very core part of the framework. So I'm going to just expand on that a little bit. Control of language, meaning and perspective, the least visible but most important form of power, the kind of implicit assumptions that we make, the thoughts and beliefs we're encouraged to hold, the things we accept as fact when actually they may not necessarily be facts, the things that are often in its more negative forms based on stereotypes. And ideological power is, one way of looking at it is that it is shaped by language and meaning, and very often works to the advantage of people who already have more power in a given society and to the disadvantage of people who already have less power. And we can see a number of examples of that around us at the moment, can't we? So whichever way you voted in the great Brexit vote, I think we can see how we were sold a certain, set of policies by the use largely of, sometimes very insulting and damaging stereotypes, and by certain uses of language, before that austerity measures, which were packaged in terms of, welfare scroungers versus hardworking families and so on, and who has benefited on the whole. On the whole, it's people who are already more wealthy who are benefiting, and people who are already more disadvantaged who are losing out. We can see a lot of this being played out again under the pandemic, of course. So we wanted to think about ideological power specifically also in relation to mental health services. Controversial slide coming up. Many people, especially those in less powerful positions, may be deprived of sound, evidence-based alternative frameworks in order to make sense of their own and others' distressing or unusual experiences. So ideological power also operates to deprive some people of important knowledge, important pieces of information about the world, important alternative perspectives. And Miranda Fricker, who's a philosopher, has described this as a form of epistemic injustice, not a form we're used to thinking about. But if we think about the psychiatric system, you know, people are very, very rarely, I would say almost never, told that, you know, your whatever it is diagnosis they're being offered or imposed, your bipolar disorder or your personality disorder, etc., that these labels are acknowledged by the very people who drew them up on the DSM committees to be lacking in scientific evidence. And actually there are many, many people who disagree with them, and there are alternative ways of understanding distress. People are not told that. The imposition of a diagnosis, of course, can facilitate further abuses of power, maybe held down and injected or whatever, worst case scenario. So, and if you start protesting and saying, no, I don't think I have got psychosis or whatever, you will soon find out where the power lies. So one of the aims of the framework is to make more accessible to ordinary people who may come into contact with mental health services different forms of knowledge. We think people have the right to know, the right to choose. This is not about stripping psychiatric labels off people. We may discuss this afterwards, I guess. You know, in our current diagnostically based system, labels are necessary for some purpose. People can define their experience as they like, but people also have the right to be offered different explanations, and actually, from our perspective, more valid ones. So I'm going to show at the end some examples of peer groups, people who have used or are using services who've been able to draw on the framework to come up with very different understandings that they weren't offered within the psychiatric system. Okay, I'm going to whiz through the next questions because, as I say, they kind of lead on from each other. So when we think about power, it's fairly obvious that power involves, the negative use of power involves being posed or facing various threats in various aspects of our lives. Don't need to go through all these. But again, I think an aspect of threat we're less used to thinking about is a threat to our ability to create and live by our own values and to make our own meanings. What sense did you make of it? The third question. This is a kind of familiar question to anyone who's a therapist of some sort. All therapy essentially is about constructing or co-constructing or reconstructing meanings. But we very much didn't want to stop thinking about meaning at a kind of individual level, at a kind of cognitions in my head level, which would be a kind of a narrow, perhaps rather stereotypical example, but we wanted to think about where the meanings come from. So we cannot understand any aspect of power, threat, or threat response separately from their meanings. Our meanings are shaped by wider discourses, which themselves are derived very often from wider ideological meanings, enterprises, projects, and purposes. So back to ideological power again. And the example I usually give is that I've spent a lot of my career working with women who've been raped or sexually abused, and each and every one of them has come along to me and said, I feel so ashamed, I feel so guilty, I should have done this, I shouldn't have done that, it's my fault, I'm a bad person, and so on and so on. And each of these meetings was held very secretly and silently and shamefully, and yet there was a remarkable consistency across these beliefs. So it's only sensible, after you've come across 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 women all saying much the same, to think about where do these discourses come from. And you don't have to look very far to see the social discourses that have all sorts of messages about women and how they should behave, and men and how they should behave, and how men or women should express or not express their sexuality, and so on, and who's responsible and what counts as being a rape as opposed to other things that are not taken so seriously, and so on and so on and so on. It's all round us, and if you wanted to take it further, you could say that there is, at a much wider level, some kind of interest in devolving a sense of blame and responsibility down to individual women, because this actually helps to shield all of us from a really frank look at the horrendous routine degree of violence and abuse in women's and girls' lives. And there are equivalent examples for men, of course. It's not just about women. Men also are subject to damaging discourses. You know, they stereotypically might focus more around perhaps being unemployed or something like that. Different, but often equally limiting and damaging. So one of the things I did along with colleagues in my last workplace was to have women set up a program of groups for women who are survivors of sexual abuse, which is a very good way of getting women together. So together they can think, well, obviously it wasn't her fault, so maybe it's not my fault. So where does these ideas come from? And the explicit aim of the group was to trace some of those meanings back to their sources in such a way that people can, we hope, turn from victims to survivors. And indeed, some of the women then went on to do training alongside us to other mental health staff about the impact of abuse in women's lives. I mean, that's not new. That's kind of feminist practice dating back decades, but the framework would very much support that kind of practice. It's also worth just saying that because we're very much focusing on ideological power, it follows that any of us can experience distress, often quite crippling degrees of distress. So it's not just about trauma. If you want to know what the framework says, go on Twitter, read that, and it's the opposite. Because actually the framework is certainly not saying all distress is due to trauma. That would be ludicrous, and that's quite clearly not the case. But if we introduce ideological power into the picture, we can see that, you know, for example, thousands of our young people are suffering really extreme forms of distress, you know, struggling with their eating, with their self-image, with self-harm and so on. Many of them will come from comfortable, secure, loving families, but they are subjected to intense pressures, achievement pressures, goal-oriented pressures in target-driven schools and so on and so on. It's not surprising these are ideologically driven pressures, which are more than enough to explain distress, even if you don't have an obvious trauma in your life. So what did you have to do to survive? And this question draws a lot on trauma-informed literature, which tells us, I think, very usefully about the role of the body in responding to, in mediating and enabling our responses to all sorts of emotionally overwhelming events. So the framework is not about denying the role of the body, blah, blah, blah. It's about drawing on a lot of really very convincing evidence, I think, about how the body mediates and enables all our experiences, including those that are distressing and overwhelming. But this is a very different kind of involvement of biological systems than the kind of chemical imbalance one, or the genetic cause of X disorder one. So a very core purpose of the framework is to restore the link between threats and threat responses. Another way of saying this is restoring the links between personal distress and social injustice. And this is a kind of interesting thing, I think, because I think it's something we kind of know. We kind of know that it's not surprising that people who live in poverty are more likely to be depressed. We kind of get that, you know, abuse and trauma can increase the likelihood of what we might call psychosis. And as soon as we know that, we kind of stop knowing it and we start talking about more pills and epidemics of depression and so on, as though this is some kind of separate phenomenon from people's contexts. And a number of, you know, we can see this a lot in COVID, can't we? It's quite interesting, all this nonsense we're reading about a mental health pandemic. And I wrote an article about this recently in the British Journal Psychiatry Psychiatric Bulletin. Obviously, people are suffering, many people are suffering a lot, but as I said in that article, not a single new research study is needed to demonstrate that being poor, jobless, isolated, ill, and bereaved makes people unhappy, or to work out the appropriate remedies. You know, people are distressed. It's never been more obvious in a way that people are distressed for reasons, and those reasons are not going to be dealt with by more pills, more mental health staff, more services, although that may have some role. Okay, so these are a number of reasons why we don't make the threat response links. It isn't always obvious. It's part of our skills as mental health professionals, I would say, to make those links, which are not obvious when you first. It's not instant or easy or clear how someone's personal story plays out. It takes time, it takes persistence. But we also need to be aware that one of the most effective ways of disconnecting threat responses from threats is to impose a psychiatric diagnosis. I think that's kind of what it's for. It's kind of what it's for at a kind of social level. It's not what individual practitioners are intending to happen, but it is the effect. And I think we do have to ask why, given all the evidence that mental health services on the whole increased rather than reduced disability, why are we still continuing down this path? Well, psychiatry as a system performs some useful purposes, among them disconnecting threats from threat responses. And there are many vested interests in trying to make sure that happens. Okay, so I always have too much to say. I'm going to very briefly touch on this aspect of the framework, which is that the framework puts forward a set of what we've called general patterns, which are like kind of meta-narratives, if you like. They are replacements, if you like, for the kind of biological patterns that diagnoses in general medicine identify, the patterns that result in, you know, diabetes or forms of cancer or whatever. Those are patterns in the way the body functions and sometimes malfunctions. And the appropriate analogy for people's thoughts, feelings and behaviours, people's emotional distress, we think is patterns which are essentially about meaning. Patterns which are, I mean, you can look all this up, but there are kind of meta-narratives, we've argued, which are based on common responses, not unique responses, common responses to common abuses of power and common threat responses that people use and draw on in order to survive. So the idea is that these meta-narratives both inform and can be informed by personal individual narratives. And if you make that kind of jump from patterns in biology to patterns in meaning, some of the puzzles attached to kind of mental illness, disorders become clear, like why do expressions of distress vary so much historically across time, cross-culturally, in a way that, you know, biological illness doesn't? Well, if patterns are fundamentally shaped by meaning, it's obvious, because meanings change historically, they change cross-culturally, and threats and threat responses will change along with those. So if this isn't very clear, there's plenty more about it on the website. I'm just, as I say, giving you a flavour, but in essence, we're talking about, this is not a very catchy phrase, patterns of embodied meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power. And they are not about things people have. I have depression, I have a personality disorder, etc. I have a mental illness. They are ultimately about what people do. They are patterns of survival. And they're not patterns that one replace diagnosis in a one-to-one way. They are loose, they're overlapping, they're in a state of development. This is the part of the project that needs a lot more work. But we think the principles are important. So to very briefly touch on another area, which is kind of cross-cultural aspects, as I said, if you think about distress in this way, then it does help to make sense of very different expressions of distress across culture and within cultures in the UK. And at the moment, the global mental health movement is involved in exporting our failed diagnostic model across the globe, in which I think I agree with psychiatrist Suman Fernando in seeing this as a form of colonialism. You know, it doesn't work in the westernized countries in which it's developed. Other cultures and countries that have managed so far without it really don't need it. And the framework actually offers a different perspective, which allows us to respect and learn from culturally appropriate ways of understanding healing distress that may be very different from those that fit better within westernized societies. It's not about exporting our model and imposing it on other places or other groups or other people. So the framework wants to go well beyond the more traditional causal factors in distress and to think about these aspects. Colonization, intergenerational trauma, some of the ways of seeing the world that we have to quite a large extent lost sight of within westernized cultures, very much to our disadvantage. This is partly what's facilitated the climate change crisis, of course. So we've actually got more, I'm speaking here as a white Western person, we have more to learn from different cultures and perspectives than they have to learn from us in the area of understanding and healing distress, I would suggest. And because the framework is centrally about narrative and meaning making, and because we are arguing that narrative and meaning making are universal human skills and attributes and fundamental to the way we all make sense of the world, there is a kind of a bridge, if you like. We may be talking about different narratives, but narratives is a kind of bridging concept. And those two blogs, which you might be interested in looking at, describe my experience of going first to New Zealand and then to Australia. And in both cases, I was able to have a most extraordinary, valuable experience of presenting the framework. And then on the second day of two-day workshops, hearing from Indigenous people, particularly a number of Maori people in New Zealand, about their understandings of distress, which are very, very different, very alien to me, very, very different. So Maori understandings are about gods and the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and so on, and narratives about how the gods interact and so on. And interestingly, in New Zealand, you can actually access services which are based on those understandings, not Western understandings. So we were able to do a kind of fascinating compare and contrast discussion. And I was really very gratified to hear that at a very core level, we could identify some similarities. We were both talking about narrative from different perspectives, very different kinds of narratives, but actually some of the Maori narratives could, in some senses, be understood as expressing what we imagine and hope are universal themes of power, threat, meaning, and threat response. Now, this is not about exporting the framework to New Zealand or anywhere else. It's about coming up with a framework which actually allows for us to work alongside and respect and learn from each other from our very different cultural perspectives. So I've got about 7 minutes left before 1:45. I'm going to move on to a couple of examples of putting the framework into practice. There are lots. And as I said, the framework, this is kind of the second stage of the project. We like to think that the framework is evidence-based in conventional terms. It draws on a lot of existing orthodox evidence. We've also questioned the whole idea about what counts as evidence and whose voices count and so on. So I am going to introduce you first to a form of evidence that doesn't rank in a kind of hierarchy of knowledge as a proved by NICE or Cochrane or anything else, but to us is every bit as valid, possibly more so, which is survivor evidence. So as I said, one of the things that was really pleasing to hear was that a couple of peer groups in the UK have come across the framework, decided to take it up entirely without professional support. In both cases, they decided to work through the questions week by week as a group in a safe, supportive way, and to use those questions to think about reconstructing their own narratives. And I have permission from Amanda, the facilitator of one of these groups, to use the example that she did of her own story. So thank you for that, Amanda. So this is the summary of her reflections on the role of power in her life. I'm going to go through these fairly briefly. As I said, the recording is available afterwards, and there are several versions of this talk on the website. But as you can see, Amanda is someone who has a not untypical history of extreme trauma and a not untypical experience of feeling re-traumatized in mental health services and receiving a label of personality disorder. So here is Amanda's summary of the threats that those abuses of power led to. There's a number of other of these stories in that small book I showed you at the beginning, by the way, the 12 quid one, including Amanda's. So as you can see, Amanda is drawing quite a lot on kind of trauma-informed language there. This is something she's informed herself about and that makes a lot of sense to her. So that's the impact of threat on her mind and body. This is Amanda's understandings of the meanings that these experiences led to. If you go on the main PTMF website, you can see the thing called a guided discussion, which Amanda and her group used in order to talk themselves through these questions. So that's the kind of more practical version of how might you prompt yourself or other people to think about these questions in relation to your own life. So those are the meanings that Amanda attributed to herself and her experiences. These are the threat responses that she's drawing on, and interestingly, in line with the PTM framework, we're not seeing threat responses as exactly equivalent to symptoms, although they do cover some of the territory of psychiatric symptoms. They also include things like being overly compliant, for example, which won't get you labelled or won't get you into trouble on the ward, but can equally be seen as something that's actually in the long term a threat response and probably not in the long term helpful to you. And here is Amanda's list of strengths and power resources, which, as you can see, are many. And it's my hope that at some point her awareness of these strengths and power resources will feed back into those meanings so that they might shift a bit. And I mean, in fact, I'm very pleased to say that Amanda and her peer group have joined us to offer training in the framework. So, and I think this has been a helpful progression in her story. She doesn't have to be just a patient. And finally, Amanda has pulled it together like this. What is my story? So psychologists in the audience, if there are some, might be able to see this is a pretty damn good formulation, isn't it? This is what psychologists call a formulation. The good news is you do not have to wait for 18 months on a psychologist waiting list to get a formulation. You can do your own. And I think this is a really good example of a change in narrative, in essence, from I am a person with personality disorder, there's something fundamentally wrong with me, to I am the survivor of very difficult circumstances. Okay, so I've got about 3 or 4 slides left. My second example is a more conventional example of collecting evidence. It's an evolving one, there's a long way to go, but this is based on a project in a trust in northwest London, where they have taken on the framework along with trauma-informed practice ideas in quite an ambitious way, a pilot study on 2 wards that's now being rolled out across their inpatient units. And although there's a lot of pretty conventional practice still going on, it appears that introducing trauma-informed practice within a PTMF framework, because the 2 things go together pretty well, has been very useful. So they are encouraging staff to think about understanding people in distress from a PTMF perspective. So this is one of their regular meetings in which they think about people's problems through that lens: power, threat, meaning, and threat responses. They are also using a lot of trauma-informed training and materials and manuals and so on, which I won't go into. But in essence, the evaluation, the staff levels of morale in staff have increased. They've gone from very high levels of restraint and seclusion to much lower levels. So in various indirect ways, something good seems to be happening. Of course, they're now wrestling with the 3rd lockdown and COVID, so some of this work is suspended, but I'm sure it will continue. So staff, again, expressing some positive views, and equally importantly, perhaps more importantly, again, these are small scale evaluations. This is an ongoing project, but the people on the ward also felt that they had been offered something very useful. So final slide, which you can read for yourselves. The restorative power of truth-telling, recovery, reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. Some of my favourite quotes from the framework. So, horribly brief overview, as I warned you, but I hope at least it's, if you have a sense of it, a vague sense, then that's achieved its purpose. If you want to read further, of course you can. If you want to have nothing further to do with it, you can. And if you want to ask some questions, then we can now do that, I hope, James, if I stop share.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I will. First of all, thank you very much indeed. Wonderful talk, Lucy. Really thought-provoking. I will invoke chair's privilege, if you don't mind, and ask the first question.
Please do. I'm just looking at the chat room. Goodness, lots of questions.
Yeah, I've picked a few out. I mean, you can
Excellent.
if you prefer to, but I'll come to those in a moment. I wanted to ask you, first off, those effects, just very quickly, actually, those effects you just saw showing benefits clinically in CNWL. What do you think is really driving that effect, those benefits? Is there something you think when you apply the framework, you think this is really what's causing those improvements?
Well, good question. More evaluation needed. I mean, a lot of things, and I wouldn't want to attribute all those beneficial effects to the framework itself. In that case, the framework is being used to support a trauma-informed model, which we have evidence about, which we know is often very helpful. So a number of things. I think what people have said, formally and mostly informally, is it kind of really makes sense to me. I kind of get it in practice. And people often very much value the emphasis on power. It does tend to put in an understanding that very often is missing, and other things follow from that. Yeah. And another something that people often say is, although at one level it's long and complicated document, another way they say it's kind of common sense, isn't it? It seems to fit with what some people already know, but it kind of validates that knowledge and gives a structure for applying it.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, a question here from Claire McLeod. She's very enthusiastic about it. She's working in crisis support. She's interested about whether there's a problem in terms of the level of insight and awareness that people might have. There may not always be a clearly defined trauma that leads to the distress. People may have therapy that do not reach a point where they have a narrative that they can attribute distress to. So how can that be handled?
I'm not sure if that person's talking about just a therapy context, because the framework is very, very, very much wider than therapy as such. And so it has lots of other applications. I mean, if we're thinking about therapy, then, I don't want to present this too simplistically. I'm a therapist and psychologist myself. It can take months, years for someone's story to emerge. It's a long process. I don't want to present it like it's kind of easy, go through these questions, tick, tick, tick. It really isn't. But I think, I've been doing quite a lot of training with some forensic services. I mean, the person themselves may not be up for, and does not have to, it's up for them, constructing a story at all, or in this way, or in any way. That's up to the person. There may be lots of good reasons for doing or not doing that. I do think staff need to have some kind of story, otherwise we default to the medical one, which is, I think, really not true, but damaging. And working in forensic services, it's been clear to me that, and particularly in what they call the male estate, a lot of these men, I don't mean doing training in the PTMF in forensic services, a lot of these men are not up for therapy, fine, but it's been really helpful for the staff to look at their lives, which of course are dominated by appalling abuses of power, which sometimes they reenact in various unhelpful ways, through that perspective. And in that way, then, prison staff working with them can at least relate and understand in a different way, even if it's not within a kind of therapeutic context as such, and even if the men themselves aren't up for kind of doing any kind of narrative work. But we're guided by what's right for the person, of course we do. And we guide on what's appropriate and what they're up for doing and what they'd rather not do.
Great. Helen Piggin has said that you mentioned the PTM framework is for everybody. Could you expand on this and how the framework might serve to reduce the false of them as dichotomies that exist between mental health professionals and users and survivors?
Yeah, it is up for everyone. So it is for everyone. So what are the things that I know a couple of people who've introduced training to their teams in the framework, and you're very welcome to do that. Lots of training resources on the website. They've started by producing their own PTMF narrative, which is quite a powerful thing to do. And it's quite a powerful way of saying, this isn't about those people with problems, it's about us and me. And here I'm going to share my story, because we all have a story. So I do, you know, it kind of follows from the fact that we all live in a context of power, and that we're all human beings, that we all experience distress, and there is no sharp dividing line between those of us who are said to be mentally ill and those who aren't. You know, we all move in and out of a state of well-being. It's a really important message, and I think it's particularly important in that at the moment what seems to be changing in rather a sinister way, I think, is, you know, for many years, certainly the early part of my career, the idea was that these mentally ill people over there, mostly kind of hidden away in hospitals, but we're now being more or less encouraged to think we all have mental health. Well, what the hell does that mean? You know, in fact, it seems to mean we all have to review our emotions with some suspicion and have some kind of bloody label on them. I think that's incredibly damaging. I think there is a need more than there ever has been before for a way of understanding distress that applies to all of us, which is not pathologizing, which is not reifying, and which actually preserves the link between our distress and our feelings and the world around us. You know, that's why I used the COVID example, because I think it's a particularly good example of how insidious this new narrative is. Don't know if I've answered your question.
Great. Question from Emma Izon. Something I was interested in as well, I was going to ask, which is about how much of the process is leveraging psychoeducation. But Emma also would like to ask, related to that, whether does that exacerbate these kind of knowledge power differentials, you know, between the mental health professional and the patient or the service user? Does that cause a problem, do you think?
Not quite sure what the question is.
I'll read it out verbatim.
Yeah.
Okay. About how psychoeducation fits with the PTMF, or is this better avoided, that framework, because it draws on positions of knowledge, power, and diagnosis? Put much better than I thought.
Okay. I mean, I don't like the term psychoeducation. don't like most things that are psycho in front of them. The framework is offering a perspective. It's not imposing a perspective. It's offering a perspective. It is partly constructed on survivor knowledge, ordinary people's knowledge, although there's professional and clinical research stuff in there as well. And it's partly developing through survivor knowledge and through ordinary people's feedbacks. You know, some of our best trainers are some survivors who've taken this up and produced these brilliant examples of the impact of power, which they've been able to illustrate really powerfully in relation to their own lives. So it's a very dense academic document, and it's also, I hope, accessible in a form that's common sense to anybody. It needs to be both. And I don't think up till recently we've got the balance quite right, because the dense academic document bit has kind of been prioritised. There are increasingly more accessible versions of it, which, as I say, are offered, not imposed, and the knowledge they're drawing on fundamentally is what we know about ourselves and our lives. You know, this is about us as human beings together. So what it tries to achieve is a sort of simplicity which can accommodate complexity, if you like, which I hope is what the question's about, and which I really, really hope are accessible to anybody without academic background, etc., etc. Now, if people want to go into more of the kind of diagnosis isn't scientifically based, then they can. It's all in there, but they don't have to. Again, I'm not sure if I've answered that exactly.
There's another question, again, something I was interested in about the framework and research and understanding the processes a bit more. So one question here is about whether researchers, how you would recommend researchers move beyond the simple frameworks they normally research about traumatic events and move closer to these nuanced explanations about
yeah.
And I suppose I was going to ask from the other side, which is one of the pros of the model is this very individualistic formulation involving, you know, your political, ideological background, etc. So my question would be, does that create a problem for research? Because there's such a, you know, heterogeneity amongst a population of people with certain symptoms and how that might have come about that makes it very difficult for empirical investigation.
Symptoms, what's that?
Right.
We're very particular about language, I have to say. Very, 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 very particular about language. Language carries ideological freight, you know, ideological meanings. Got to unpick that or you'll find yourself back in the same territory. First question first, how do you, well, I mean, the PTF principles do imply different research approaches, but we're not, as some people have said, anti-science and anti-positivist. That's an interesting accusation, isn't it? What we're saying is appropriate methodologies and perspectives for, you know, the phenomena that you're discussing. So we've in fact drawn on quite a lot of positive research, which is orthodox kind of research, but we don't think a positivist lens is suitable for understanding human emotional suffering. But, you know, you can look at all sorts of interesting research papers and find some interesting things in them. But we are arguing, obviously, for research not based on diagnostic categories. What a great way to undermine your findings before you even start. This isn't difficult for you, James. These are non-valid categories, so let's not start with them, please. And in the main document, chapter 8, we've outlined quite a number of possible implications of the framework in different areas, which include service design and commissioning, access to welfare and benefits, research, and so on. And this is not these are not formal recommendations or anything like that. They're saying, well, from this lens, we might approach research like this. So one obvious implication is more qualitative research, isn't it? And actually giving that a higher status. But we do need to get away from diagnostically based research, I have to say, although we've drawn out research as part of the massive overview because that's what's out there, but it's possible to take some of that stuff and look at it a little bit differently.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from Amanda Morrison. I wonder whether Lucy could say something about the prevalence of ADHD diagnoses in school children and how the framework might enable us to find a more helpful way of thinking about what might be going on.
Oh dear. How controversial do we want to be today? ADHD. I mean, you know, the framework doesn't go into any particular diagnosis, so it doesn't have a view on what we might call ADHD or might call bipolar or whatever. It's a kind of set of principles, if you like, within which we would, well, do two things, I guess, from a framework point of view. One, we would be very concerned about the massive rise in people diagnosed with this mysterious condition called ADHD. And of course, you have to be clear what you're saying. There are children who find it very hard to concentrate, who are very restless, who can't, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if we get a massive expansion in a certain diagnosis, any diagnosis, then we have to wonder what's going on, what's driving this. And of course, the framework would put this very much in a bigger context. You know, we know that you're more at risk of getting this ridiculous label if you're a boy and, you know, and you're younger in your year than, you know, so boys very often aren't ready to go to school. My own son wasn't. And schools are more target driven and we're setting unrealistic expectations. We send children to school much younger than just about any other European country. And what's that about? And so on and so on and so on. So that'd be one perspective. The other perspective would, I think, to be very frank about the lack of any kind of validity for this label. And the third perspective would be to think about, well, what's the story here? Not just what's the biggest story about the rise in diagnosis, but in a particular person's or young child's case, what is the story? You know, it's going to be different in every case, but there will be a story. And, you know, for some people, it'll be more obvious traumas. Maybe this child's witnessing domestic violence at home, is in a state of arousal and can't concentrate, but maybe it's just simply they're too young for school. We don't want to be pathologizing the individual. So, I mean, same speech goes for any other diagnosis you throw at me.
Matthew Elton was intrigued by the narratives in New Zealand, being such that they could enable access to services. Interested to hear thoughts on how we passport access to services without diagnostic label. If services are a scarce resource, how could we better deploy it where it's best needed without the old diagnostic tools?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's a very kind of practical thing, isn't it? As I said, we live in a diagnostically based world, and we have to accommodate ourselves to that extent. We have to be kind of idealistic. The framework's very idealistic and pragmatic and realistic, and live in the world we live in. I've had lots of experience of doing that. Very difficult it is too sometimes. But in fact, this is one of the questions we addressed in chapter 8 of the main document. And Kate Alsop, who's was our research assistant and editor, in fact carried out a survey of the basis on which you get access to a number of different services, and found that in fact, it often isn't the case you need to have a label to get into a service. And in fact, in very practical terms, and I remember this from my last clinical job, admission criteria usually are often things like severe and enduring distress or something like that. And that's not a very precise definition, but it's as precise as you can get. There isn't a more precise one. At some point, you just have to make some arbitrary decision, and using a diagnosis makes it seem less arbitrary, but of course it's just as arbitrary because these are arbitrarily applied labels with arbitrary boundaries. So in fact, some of those practical problems I don't think are as big an obstacle as they might seem to be. We don't always use diagnosis for access to services, and there are kind of workarounds that are actually already in play in quite a number of services.
Great. Verity was intrigued by the implementation of the framework alongside trauma-informed services, and was wondering if this could sit very well alongside, compassion-focused work. If you had any thoughts on it.
Very, very much so. I mean, whenever I do a presentation, there's always someone comes up to me and say, "This reminds me so much of X," and X is their favourite therapy. And they're usually right. I mean, we've actually quoted quite a lot from Paul Gilbert. I'm a fan of his work, in the main document. There's obvious compatibilities with these ideas. And at the back of the overview, which is the shorter version of the two main documents, we got a number of examples. We've got 13 examples of good practice that's already existing, that is, very compatible with the framework's principles. As I said, it's not about replacing things, but it's about giving them a bigger context and further validation and support. So yes, CFT, I mean, I think that's got a lot to offer. It would fit very well.
Okay, great. Laura would like to ask...
As long as you don't think it's a CFT for bipolar disorder or something terrible like that. But CFT as an approach, definitely.
Laura would like to ask, how can survivors, not only professionals, adopt the key themes of the PTMF to their healing when, for example, financial security through disability benefit entitlement is gauged upon diagnosis, amount of severity of diagnoses, amount of medication prescriptions that the service user or survivor uses?
It's another kind of we live in the world we live in question, isn't it? And one thing we've said very clearly in the framework, and this question comes up quite a lot, is we have said, obviously the priority is for service users to get access to the benefits and supports they need and to the services they need. Obviously that's a priority. So, I mean, my short answer is you need to do what you need to do. And I've spent quite a lot of time supporting people to fill in benefit forms, but what I would do that's perhaps a bit different is I would say we need to put a label in this box. Let's have a discussion together about what label is most acceptable to you and is most likely to get you the support you need. So that's very different from saying you need long-term support because you have chronic relapsing bipolar disorder or whatever. And I think there is I suppose at the very least the framework would help people to distance themselves if they want to from that kind of identity. It's one thing to say, I need to say this for this purpose. It's another thing to have been told that you must see yourself and your problems and your identity and define yourself in this way. We'd want to offer that as a choice. So we've also in the framework discussed in a very hypothetical way, outlining pros and cons, how welfare systems and benefit systems could be devised that weren't based on diagnostic categories. And again, it's one of those problems that in some senses I don't think would be too difficult to to change, because actually, in effect, what you're being asked for is professional confirmation that you are struggling, and that could be provided in all sorts of forms. There's no specific label will guarantee you access to benefits. Indeed, some labels are exclusion criteria for some services. So there could be kind of workarounds with that, like suffering severe and chronic distress or something like that. And, you know, some people are happy to use their diagnostic labels to access benefits, and they find those labels helpful. That's absolutely fine. We're not about tearing that off people. But quite a lot of people really resent the idea they have to label themselves in this way in order to desperately jump through hoops to get the bare minimum to survive. And, you know, we don't think that's a good system. We don't think that's a good system. And we don't think such systems have to be based, at least theoretically, on diagnostic labels.
Great. I'm just aware of the time. We're going to continue. So those who are interested to continue and have a chat or ask questions, please do so. Just for those who have to head off, I just wanted to mention a couple of quick things. Of course, it's been fantastic, Lucy, coming to talk today. It's been really interesting and thought-provoking. We've got many more such talks on the agenda coming up. The next one will be on the 12th of February, and one of Roehampton's own, that's Mick Cooper, Professor of Counselling Psychology, is going to present results from their quite incredible ESRC-funded Ethos project, which has been a really large RCT looking at the effects of humanistic counselling in 18 secondary schools. So it's going to be really interesting. 12th of February. Again, follow us on Twitter at psych_roe, ROE. Email me at pros@roehampton.ac.uk to get notification of that. And of course, you know, I hope to see as many of you back there for that talk as possible. So I just wanted to get that there before everyone disappears, but there's still a very large number of people here in the group hoping to hear a bit more. I'll pick up on the questions that I have gathered from the above. The next one I picked out was from Annette Magnus, who says that she noticed using alcohol to numb experiences was framed as a threat response. So would developing a problematic relationship with activities like using smartphones or playing video games, a video game addiction if you like, be considered threat responses in the PTM framework?
My two favourite threat responses. That's what's in with the latest lockdown, alcohol and smartphones. Well, I mean, anything could be a threat response, but it doesn't have to be, is the simple answer. You know, and you can only define that by talking with the person and working out, you know, the context in which they're having their 5th glass of Sauvignon or spending their 6th hour on their smartphone. Yeah, it's the only possible answer. I mean, anything might be, but nothing has to be. It's like hearing voices is classically seen, or classically was always seen as a psychiatric symptom, but we now know, you know, some people hear voices and they find them valuable and they're an important part of their lives and they're not necessarily distressing to them. Only you can answer that, possibly by working through the guided discussion. And, you know, we all have to use threat responses. My God, I couldn't survive without my threat responses. So it's not about saying threat response bad. It's about saying, is there a point at which this becomes more unhelpful than helpful? But you don't have to call it a symptom.
Right. Lorna would just like to ask whether you know of any psychologists or services using the framework in parenting capacity assessments.
Not that I know of, but it's not an area I work in, and we've got about 30 examples of good practice waiting to go up on the website. So keep an eye on the website, I would say.
Samantha Russell, could Lucy perhaps speak about how the PTMF might connect with an understanding of the power of common factors in psychotherapy, for example, the healing power of relationships?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we know that the single most consistent finding in about 70 years of research into therapy, dating back to Carl Rogers, is that common factors are the most important healing ingredient, aren't they? The necessary and, according to some people, sufficient conditions for change. And that's very, very, very much in keeping with the framework, which on the whole has a slightly skeptical. I think there are therapy skills we can use and learn, but I mean, I've always believed personally that it's about being a decent person, being a human being in the room with another human being. And again, drawing from trauma-informed practice, the language that we use in the framework is very much about healing, witnessing, validating, honouring. You know, I really like that way of thinking about it. You know, treating, no. You know, therapizing sometimes maybe, but you know, in the same way as meaning making is an ordinary human skill, so is our ability, which is sometimes compromised, of course, but our ability to be a person with another person who's in distress.
A question from Stephanie Okwu. She works in a psychosis and bipolar secondary care service. How do you think the framework could be worked into?
Got to do that. Got to do that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How do you think the framework could be worked into such a service, especially regarding assessments? So another kind of practical question.
Well, same way as in any other service. You know, of course, the framework does not believe in these categories or in dividing people up in this way. And indeed, trauma-informed practice doesn't. You know, according to trauma-informed practice, we're all suffering from a rather similar, overlapping, complex mix of difficulties and adversities. And, you know, we have an overlapping way of dealing with them, some of which ended up being labelled bipolar or psychosis. But I mean, in any service, you could start how you like. You could start by by using this framework with some of the people you're working with. You could start by introducing it as a kind of discussion group in your team. You could start by thinking about new arrivals in the service and looking at their stories through this perspective, perhaps using a kind of, you know, supervision or team formulation structure. You could do it how you like. The way, I mean, I'm quite a fan of a team formulation, which is something I've spent a lot of time writing about and practicing, if done ethically and sensitively. And the way they did it in Northwick Park, Northwest London, was that team formulation was very much the engine that drives the change, if you like, because it's a unique, I think, and powerful option of getting staff together to think differently and to support each other to think differently, using a different lens and facilitated by whoever's up for facilitating it.
Okay, a couple more. Darren Lee says, fascinating stuff, and offers a framework for counselling psychologists to work multi-theoretically, brackets, which we love, close brackets. I wondered if you anticipated it having any problems with its application to, and there are, quotes, diagnosed OCD. I was thinking framing obsessions or compulsions as understandable responses or adaptations might reinforce compulsions, reassurance seeking.
Sorry, the final sentence.
I was thinking framing obsessions or compulsions as understandable responses or adaptations might reinforce compulsions stroke reassurance seeking.
Okay. Yeah, don't know quite what to say about that. I mean, I've worked with a lot of people, some of whom had very severe forms of what you might call OCD, and it seemed to me that all of these could be framed as threat responses. But, you know, so I think if that makes sense to the person, that's the way to go. I mean, you know, any kind of narrative of that sort opens up, as well as being helpful, opens up areas of that may be difficult to, you know, the implications may be difficult. You know, the implications are almost by definition wider than I need to get better control of this, and much more likely to be I need to think differently and do differently in a lot of areas of my life. So there might be all sorts of ways in which that narrative in some ways seems more difficult. Of course, nobody has to have it. But, you know, I've always, this is well before PTMF, I've always seen what we might call OCD in that way. And I mean, I'm not a great believer in CBT, as you might have kind of gathered. I've never worked in a CBT way with those kind of problems. And, you know, it's often been very successful. So, but I mean, it's up to you, up to the person you're working with, whether they are interested in viewing things through that lens. And, you know, there may well be a case for specific sort of strategies about response prevention. Some people find those helpful. I find these can become a sort of form of OCD in themselves. You know, add in some other rituals on top of your rituals and see which set of rituals wins. You know, some people find them helpful.
If you think of the more, if we think about hallucinations and delusions, you know, the things you
don't like those words.
Oh, sorry.
Unusual beliefs and sensory experiences.
All right, unusual beliefs and sensory experiences.
We all have them. We all have them.
For anyone listening who's wondering why I keep getting not told off, but corrected, because my background is schizophrenia research from neuroimaging, clinical trials and things. So of course we speak about these things in a different way. But I was thinking, when you think of those, when they're in their most acute form, how do you think that the PTMF kind of speaks to how that comes about? I know there's kind of the idea of having these solutions to threats which kind of somehow become perpetuating in a kind of maladaptive sense. Can you expand on that any more? How did those, what seems like a kind of your normal threat response become, how does that lead to these really kind of life-dominating experiences that kind of last?
Okay, so I don't think the framework has specific answers to what that causal chain would be, and I don't think anybody does very much, but I think the nearest we have does come from trauma-informed perspectives, in particular the role of dissociation. So this is not PTF's idea, this is some of the stuff we've drawn on. You know, it seems to me that if you put that together with a lot of the work of the Hearing Voices Network, then, you know, if not for everybody, for many people, there is a way of understanding it as, well, in trauma-informed practice, this would be kind of, you know, memories leaking out, wouldn't it? It'd be dissociative responses. It would be the kind of the abuser who hurt you and his voice appearing in a different form, because, you know, we now understand that overwhelming memories and feelings can be encoded in different parts of the brain and can appear quite separate from autobiographical narrative. It'd be that. I'm not claiming that's a PTMF understanding, but that would be in keeping with a lot of the stuff we work on. And the PTMF narrative would very much be saying these are meaningful responses to difficult situations.
Do these reactions, are they ever so strong that you feel they need some sort of intervention before PTMF framework could come into play?
Well, the PTMF framework is a perspective. So from my point of view, I'd always be, that's your starting point, is a perspective. Now, what you might or might not do on the basis of having that perspective is a separate question. Okay. And, you know, for many people, yes, I mean, this is a team formulation perspective as well. It's much too early and perhaps may never be appropriate to offer certain specific kinds of interventions, but we need to be clear what perspective we're starting from. That has to be before anything. And, you know, I've worked with lots of people with, you know, psychosis, and I fully appreciate these can be absolutely overwhelming, appalling, torturous events. Indeed, you know, our two survivor co-authors, Eleanor and Jackie, are survivors of really very, very, very extreme forms of what would be called in conventional terms psychotic experiences. And they found ways of working through those, and they very much appeared in the context of their lives, and they are meaningful to them, and they both still have voices and have experiences that other people call delusional, and they're a valued part of their lives. So they're living examples, and that's a long way pre-PTMF, but that's the kind of survivor expertise that is extraordinarily valuable and can, you know, illustrate the points of the document that we eventually produce together.
Well, I think we have gone over the time of overtime, and so I'm going to wrap things up. It's been a fascinating hour and a half or so. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to the PROS meeting. It's great to hear more about this framework. You know, its influence is growing, and you know, lots for people even of different backgrounds like me to have a think about as well. It's really been very insightful. Just before we wrap up, a reminder just again, the next PROS is 12th of February. Mick Cooper from Roehampton talking about his Ethos project and the use of humanistic counselling in secondary schools. Again, I think it's going to be great. Follow us on Twitter. Email me if you want to be on the list. But just for now, thank you very much, Lucy, for your time and for your guide through the PTMF framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, James. Thank you.